and met a reporter for one of the nightly news shows, national nightly news. And he said that in their editorial meetings, that everything, editorial and business, that everything they do is based around a 5-year horizon for there even continuing to be a nightly news. That in 5 years, that it'll either be broken up and put on the web, maybe there will be no nightly news at all. So that's the sort of world that people operate in. Because we're seen as having a successful new journalism model, I'm constantly, executives from big metropolitan newspapers and whatever want to pick my brain and see what it is we're doing right, which is not, they don't get much out of it because we have this tiny little company that we can barely keep running, but they want to. So it gives me the opportunity to get sort of a sense of what these people are thinking, how they're planning for their future. And if I were running one of the big metropolitan papers that has pretensions to be a national paper, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, I would be thinking in my long-term business planning, how are we going to make the transition to being a news organization at the point at which we're no longer producing a daily physical paper? And this seems obvious to me. The economics of print for newspapers doesn't make sense, I think, over the medium term. I mean, say the 20-year horizon. And so I asked this person, I said, how do you, what's the model? How are you planning for that transition? And the answer I got was like, we're not. It's sort of facing the obvious and not, and just being in complete denial about it. So one of the best sort of summaries of what's happening today in journalism and how the internet is really tearing it apart comes from Orville Schell. He has this line where he says that the mainstream media, the mass media, is like the Roman Empire, and we're in the period of its fall, and it's breaking apart into what you had in the aftermath of the Roman Empire, which is a series of sort of barbarian fiefdoms, but much more broken up, much more fragmented. And beside the fact that sort of puts me in the barbarian category, I think this is very apt for what's happening. And it's not, I don't think necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a lot of romanticism about the world that most of us were born into, where no matter whichever city you lived in, there were 1 or 2 big metropolitan newspapers. There were 3 national news networks that sort of defined what the news was. And that did give basically a common experience across, to a great extent, across class, across ideological divides. Everybody watched, Peter Jennings, Walter Cronkite, whoever it was. But that's a relatively new model of what journalism is, and I think there are a lot of reasons why it wasn't necessarily a good one. So the breaking up that the internet is forcing, I think, is a good thing, and what we see now, what we've seen for the last decade or so, and what we'll probably see for the next decade or two, is a vast transition, sort of a very uncomfortable if you're in the journalism field, but an example of creative destruction, of seeing one entire model of business and news reporting being destroyed and another one coming into existence. And I think it's an era will be an era of, it's good for journalism, but probably bad for journalists. in the same way that any great economic transition is. I mean, if you study economic history, the benefits brought about by the Industrial Revolution are you can see them everywhere around us. And yet, for a century, for the people who were, ground down in those gears, it was terrible. And, I see this in my own work. I mean, it's really, it's hard to even talk about. We have entry-level reporting jobs that only pay enough to, support someone relatively recently out of college. And yet, each time we offer one, I will get some application from some very senior, incredibly talented investigative journalist. And some people who are, at least within the journalism community, people who are household names, applying for one of these jobs. And it gives you who's been, laid off from some big newspaper or a television network or something like that. And it gives you a chilling feeling for what's happening in this profession, the human costs of that turnover.